The last call came at 5:32 in the evening. Sarah remembered the exact time because she was looking at the clock when the phone rang. She was standing at the stove, stirring soup, when she heard Thomas's familiar voice. "I'll be home soon," he said, and she could hear the usual tiredness in his voice after a workday. "I'll take that short alley. It's quicker." "All right, I'll be waiting," she replied, not thinking much of his words. Thomas always looked for shorter routes home. It was his habit. The call ended and Sarah continued preparing dinner. She set the table, turned on the television so it wouldn't be so quiet, and sat down to wait. Half an hour passed, then an hour, then two. The soup grew cold in the pot, and Thomas didn't appear. Sarah dialed his number. The phone was switched off. At first, she wasn't worried. Maybe he was held up at work. Maybe he ran into a colleague. Maybe his battery died. But when the clock showed 10 in the evening, anxiety began creeping up on her slowly, like cold fog. She called his friends and colleagues. No one had seen Thomas after work. His boss confirmed that he had left at the usual time, around 5:30. Sarah paced around the flat, looked out the window, waited for the sound of keys in the lock. But the night passed in empty expectations. In the morning, she went to the police. The constable listened to her indifferently, leafing through some papers. "Your husband left?" he asked without looking up. "Maybe he ran away from married life?" "It happens all the time." "You don't understand," Sarah clenched her hands. "He would never do such a thing. All his belongings are at home. He hasn't touched the money in his account. They were expecting him at an important meeting at work this morning." "Well, file a report," the constable muttered. "But bear in mind, adults have the right to go wherever they want." They accepted the report, but Sarah understood there wouldn't be much enthusiasm in the search. She decided to act on her own. Returning home, she began methodically examining the flat, looking for any clues. In Thomas's desk, she found his old dictaphone. He sometimes recorded ideas for work or just his thoughts on it. Sarah played the last recordings. Her husband's voice sounded strange, as if he was speaking in whispers, looking over his shoulder. The recording captured his footsteps on asphalt, the distant noise of cars, and then silence, as if he had gone somewhere where the sounds of the city faded away. "This place," Thomas whispered into the microphone. "It mustn't see my face." The recording cut off. Sarah replayed this phrase several times, trying to understand what he meant. What place? Why mustn't it see his face? And why was he even recording this? The next day, she decided to talk to the neighbors. Maybe someone had seen Thomas that evening, maybe noticed something strange. But the neighbors' answers only increased her confusion. "He left ages ago, didn't he?" said Mrs. Fletcher from the third floor, shaking her head. 2 months ago or more." "What are you talking about?" Sarah didn't understand. "He disappeared the day before yesterday." "Aren't you a widow then?" The neighbor was surprised. "I thought you were living alone now." Sarah felt the ground disappearing from under her feet. She went to other neighbors, but the pattern repeated. Some said Thomas had left long ago. Others didn't remember such a person at all. Still others looked at her with sympathy, as if she were mad. Only old Mr. Whitmore from the first floor said something that made her blood freeze in her veins. "I saw him coming back the night before last, late in the evening. Only it wasn't him." "What do you mean?" asked Sarah. "Same walk, same clothes, even the same face." The old man shook his head. "But the eyes were like a doll's, empty." Sarah began to doubt her own sanity. Maybe she was remembering something wrong. Maybe Thomas really had mentioned a trip. But no, she was certain. He had called her the day before yesterday and said he would be home soon. In the evening, while searching the flat for any clues, she noticed something she hadn't noticed before. In the corridor behind an old wardrobe, the wall looked different. The brick joints were uneven, the paint fresher. Sarah took a hammer and began tapping the wall. The sound was hollow. There was space behind the wall. She worked all night, dismantling the bricks. By morning, there was a gaping hole in the wall, and behind it she discovered a small room that wasn't on the flat's plans. The room was covered with photographs. Thomas was everywhere, but something in these pictures was terribly wrong. In some photos, he had no pupils. His eyes were white, blind. In others, his face seemed waxy, like a mannequin's. And in some, his facial features were blurred, as if someone had tried to erase or change them. Sarah picked up one of the photographs. In it, Thomas was standing in some alley, but his facial expression was completely alien. He was smiling, but this smile didn't reach his eyes. It was mechanical, lifeless. On the back of the photo was written, Blind Alley, 1987. But this was impossible. In 1987, Thomas was only 3 years old. Sarah spent the whole day studying the found photographs. Some were dated decades ago, but all showed her husband, not aging, unchanging. And in all of them, something was wrong with his face, his eyes, his smile. In the evening, she went to the city library to find information about Blind Alley. In old city chronicles from the beginning of the last century, she discovered mentions of this place. The alley had indeed existed once, but was bricked up in the 1920s after a series of strange incidents. Blind Alley, a place where people forgot themselves, read one of the records. Many entered there and came out changed, not remembering who they were or what had happened to them. The city council decided to brick up the entrance to prevent further incidents. On an old city map, Sarah found the location of the alley. It should have been a few blocks from their house, right on the route from Thomas's work. Late in the evening, she went there. The modern street looked ordinary. Residential houses, shops, nothing suspicious. But when Sarah reached the place where, according to the map, the entrance to Blind Alley should have been, she saw a narrow gap between two buildings. The gap was so inconspicuous that it would be easy to miss. Sarah took out her torch and peered inside. The passage did indeed exist, although at first glance it seemed like just a technical niche. She squeezed inside. Around the corner, something incredible opened up. The alley widened, turning into a real street, but a street from another time, from another world. The houses here were the same as in the ordinary city, but they looked dead, abandoned. The windows were dark, paint was peeling, and this whole place was shrouded in oppressive silence. Sarah walked down this ghostly street, lighting her way with the torch. Her steps echoed hollowly between the buildings, but there were no other sounds, no cars, no people, not even wind. She reached the house that should correspond to their house in the real city. She raised her torch and looked at the windows. In one of them, on their floor, stood a motionless figure. It was Thomas. He stood at the window and looked down, straight at her. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood and looked. Sarah screamed, waved her arms, but he didn't react, as if he couldn't see her or couldn't respond. She rushed to the entrance, but the door wouldn't open. She tried the first-floor windows. Locked. The house was inaccessible, and Thomas continued standing at the window like a statue. Sarah spent several hours in that place trying to find a way into the house, but unsuccessfully. When dawn began to break, she returned home, shaken by what she had seen. On the third day, Thomas returned. Sarah heard the sound of keys in the lock and ran out to the hallway. He stood by the door, taking off his jacket, as if nothing had happened. "Where have you been?" she cried, rushing to him. "What do you mean?" Thomas looked at her with surprise. "I was at work. You disappeared for 3 days. I looked for you, filed a police report." "What are you talking about?" He shook his head. "I didn't disappear. Maybe you got something confused?" Sarah looked closely at her husband. Outwardly, he was the same facial features, the same voice, the same clothes. But something had changed. He was cold, as if his body wasn't producing heat. When she hugged him, he didn't return the embrace, stood motionless, like a mannequin. "Do you remember calling me the day before yesterday? You said you were going home through a short alley." "I don't remember," Thomas shrugged. "Maybe I called. What's the big deal?" He spoke mechanically, as if repeating learned phrases, and he avoided looking into her eyes, constantly looking away. At dinner, Sarah noticed that he tried not to look at the mirror in the corner. When she asked why he was avoiding mirrors, Thomas turned sharply to her. "What mirrors?" "I'm not avoiding mirrors. You're acting strange." But he really did avoid mirrors, and when he accidentally saw his reflection, he quickly looked away, as if it caused him discomfort. At night, he lay beside her in bed, but didn't sleep. Sarah felt that he lay motionless, didn't breathe the way a sleeping person should breathe. And when she pretended to sleep and opened her eyes slightly, she saw that he was staring at the ceiling with wide open eyes, not blinking. In the morning, when Thomas left for work, Sarah decided to check the bricked-up room. To her surprise, the room no longer existed. The wall was intact, without traces of destruction. The paint old, not fresh, as if she had never demolished this wall. She began to doubt her own sanity. Maybe all this was a dream? Maybe she was going mad from stress? But in the evening, something happened that finally convinced her that something supernatural was occurring. Thomas was sitting on the sofa, watching television, and suddenly said, "Something remained there. It was looking for a way out. I showed it the door." "What did you say?" Sarah jumped up. "What?" He looked at her puzzledly. "I didn't say anything. You said something about something that remained there, and about a door." "You're hearing things." Thomas shook his head. "I'm watching the news." But Sarah had clearly heard these words, and the intonation with which he had spoken them was completely uncharacteristic of him. The voice sounded mechanical, like a talking doll's. The next day she went to Blind Alley again. The alley was there, and she again found herself in that dead version of the city. But this time, she didn't go to their house, but began exploring other buildings. In the basement of one of the houses, she discovered something that made her heart stop. Thomas lay there, the real Thomas. He was dead, his face dried up like a mask, his skin yellowed and wrinkled. In his hands, he clutched a photograph of Sarah. On the back of the photo was written in his handwriting, "Don't trust him. He remembered my shape, but he is not me." Sarah sat beside her husband's body for a long time, crying and trying to understand what had happened. If the real Thomas was dead, then who was living with her in the flat? What kind of being had taken his appearance? She remembered old Mr. Whitmore's words. The eyes were like a doll's. Empty. When she returned home, Thomas was sitting in the kitchen drinking tea. Seeing her, he smiled, but this smile didn't touch his eyes. "Where have you been?" he asked. "Walking," Sarah lied. "You look upset." He tilted his head, as if studying her. "Has something happened?" Sarah looked at this creature that was pretending to be her husband and felt goosebumps crawling up her spine. It knew. It sensed that she had learned something. "Everything's fine," she said, trying to speak calmly. But Thomas continued studying her with his gaze, and she noticed that his facial features were beginning to change slightly, becoming less distinct, as if he was struggling to maintain the adopted form. "Are you sure?" he asked, and his voice sounded different, with a slight echo, as if coming from far away. "I'm sure." Sarah backed towards the kitchen exit. The creature continued looking at her, and its face was losing resemblance to Thomas's face more and more. The features were blurring, the eyes becoming empty, whitish, the skin taking on a waxy tinge. Sarah ran out of the kitchen, grabbed her coat, and rushed out of the flat. Behind her, she heard slow, heavy steps. The creature was following her. She ran through the streets, not choosing her route, until she reached Blind Alley. There she stopped, breathing heavily, and tried to collect her thoughts. The real Thomas was dead. Something that had taken his appearance was living in her house. But why? What did it need? And how to get rid of it? She remembered the city chronicles, a place where people forgot themselves. Maybe this place was somehow connected to what had happened to Thomas. Maybe he had fallen into a trap, and this creature had captured his body, his memories, his life. Sarah entered the ghostly version of the city again. This time she explored it more thoroughly, looking into every window, checking every house. In the center of this dead quarter, she discovered a small square that didn't exist in the real city. On the square stood an antique mirror in a dark frame, covered with thick cobwebs. Sarah approached the mirror and looked into it. In the reflection, she saw not herself, but Thomas, the real living Thomas. He stood behind the glass, as behind a shop window, and soundlessly screamed something, pounding his fists on the glass from inside. Sarah understood. The mirror was a prison. Thomas was trapped in the reflection, and his place in the real world was taken by his double, his shadow, his reflection that had gained its own will. She tried to break the mirror with her fist, but the glass proved incredibly strong. She looked around for a stone, a brick, any heavy object. At that moment, she heard footsteps. The creature that was pretending to be Thomas was walking towards her down the street of the ghost city. But here in this place, it no longer tried to maintain human appearance. Its face was blurred, indefinite, the features constantly changing like a reflection in water. "You shouldn't have come here," said the creature in a voice that sounded like multiple voices layered together. "Now you know too much." "Give me back my husband," Sarah shouted. "He's mine now," the creature came closer. "And soon you will be mine too. I will study your face, your voice, your memories. I will live your life." Sarah backed away, not taking her eyes off the creature. It slowly approached, and with each step its appearance became more indefinite, more alien. Suddenly she noticed a piece of brick on the ground. She grabbed it and struck the mirror with all her strength. The glass cracked. Bright light burst from the crack, and a sound like a scream was heard. The creature stopped, its blurred face contorted with pain or rage. "No!" it screamed. "You don't understand what you're doing!" Sarah struck again. The crack widened, and Thomas began emerging from it. First his hand, then his head, then his whole body. He looked pale, exhausted, but alive. "Sarah!" he shouted. "Run! This place is collapsing!" Indeed, everything around began collapsing. Houses swayed and crumbled. The ground cracked. The sky darkened. The creature screamed. Its appearance finally disintegrated, turning into a shapeless shadow. Sarah grabbed Thomas's hand, and they ran towards the exit from Blind Alley. Behind them, the world was falling apart, disappearing as if it had never existed. They burst out of the alley onto an ordinary street and fell onto the pavement, breathing heavily. When Sarah looked back, she saw that the passage between the houses no longer existed. Just two buildings standing close together, without a gap, without a passage. "What was that?" she asked. "I don't know." Thomas shook his head. "I remember walking home, turning into the alley, and a blank. As if I was sleeping for a very long time and having strange dreams. In the dream, I was trapped in a mirror, and someone else was living my life." "It wasn't a dream," Sarah hugged him. "You were trapped there, and your double was living in our flat." They sat on the pavement, clinging to each other until they had fully recovered. Then they got up and went home. At home, everything was normal. There was no bricked-up room, no photographs. Everything looked as it should have looked. "Maybe I dreamed all this?" asked Sarah. "I don't know." Thomas sat on the sofa, ran his hands through his hair. "But I remember that strange dream. I remember calling to you from there, asking for help." "I heard," Sarah sat beside him, "and I came for you." They embraced, and Sarah felt that he was warm again, alive, real. His heart beat steadily. He breathed normally, and in his eyes there was life again, emotions, love. "Thank you for pulling me out," he whispered, but I can hear it still whispering. "What's whispering?" "That creature. It's somewhere nearby, waiting for another chance." Sarah felt cold. Maybe the mirror was broken, but the creature wasn't destroyed? Maybe it was just waiting for the right moment to try again to capture someone's life? "What shall we do?" she asked. "We'll leave," Thomas said decisively. "We'll leave this city, as far away as possible. We'll start a new life somewhere where this creature won't find us." The next day, they began packing their belongings. Thomas quit his job. They sold the flat for a ridiculously low price, just to leave quickly. The neighbors who just recently had said that Thomas had left long ago, or that he didn't exist at all, now behaved normally, as if they had never said anything strange. The constable who had taken the missing person report claimed that there had been no report. All traces of that strange incident disappeared, as if reality had corrected itself. A week later, they were sitting on a train that was taking them to another city, hundreds of kilometers from Blind Alley. Sarah looked out the window at the fields and forests flowing past and thought about what had happened. Maybe it was collective madness. Maybe stress and fatigue made her see things that weren't there. Maybe Thomas had simply lost his memory for a few days, and everything else was a dream. But sometimes in the silence, she still heard a quiet whisper coming from somewhere far away. And she saw Thomas flinch, as if he too heard something. They never spoke about it aloud, but both knew that something was following them, something patient and persistent that would find them again sooner or later. For now they traveled further from that city, from that street where a non-existent alley hid a mirror in which reflections gained their own life and stole other people's destinies. They traveled towards a new life, hoping that distance would protect them from what had once tried to steal their happiness. But deep down, they both knew that some things don't depend on distance, some things don't live in a particular place, but in reality itself, in its cracks and crevices, where dreams border on reality and reflections can come alive. And late at night, when the train raced through dark fields, Sarah sometimes noticed in the window not her own reflection, but someone else's strange face that stared at her intently and soundlessly, moved its lips as if saying something. And she would tightly squeeze Thomas's hand, reminding herself that they were alive, that they were together, and that their story had a happy ending, at least for now.